Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f1 to b5. Pawn a7 to a6. Bishop b5 to a4. Knight g8 to f6. Castle kingside. Pawn b7 to b5. Bishop a4 to b3. Knight f6 takes e4. Pawn d2 to d3. Knight e4 to c5. Bishop c1 to g5. Pawn f7 to f6. Bishop g5 to d2. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to c3. Pawn b5 to b4. Bishop b3 takes d5. Pawn b4 takes c3. Bishop d5 takes c6, check. Bishop c8 to d7. Bishop c6 takes a8. Pawn c3 takes b2. Rook a1 to b1. Queen d8 takes a8. Rook b1 takes b2. Bishop f8 to e7. Pawn d3 to d4. Knight c5 to a4. Rook b2 to b1. Bishop d7 to g4. Pawn d4 takes e5. Bishop g4 takes f3. Queen d1 takes f3. Queen a8 takes f3. Rook b1 to b8, check. King e8 to d7. Pawn e5 to e6, check. King d7 takes e6. Rook f1 to e1, check. Queen f3 to e2. Rook e1 takes e2, check. King e6 to f7. Rook b8 takes h8. Pawn h7 to h6. Pawn c2 to c4. Knight a4 to b2. Rook e2 to e4. Knight b2 to d3. Rook h8 to h7. King f7 to g8. Rook h7 takes h6. Pawn g7 takes h6. Rook e4 takes e7. Knight d3 to e5. Bishop d2 takes h6. Pawn c7 to c5. Rook e7 to e6. King g8 to f7. Rook e6 takes e5. Pawn f6 takes e5. Bishop h6 to e3. King f7 to e6. Bishop e3 takes c5. Pawn a6 to a5. Pawn h2 to h4. Pawn a5 to a4. Pawn h4 to h5. Pawn e5 to e4. Pawn g2 to g4. King e6 to f6. King g1 to g2. King f6 to a5. Pawn g4 to g5. King e5 to f5. Pawn h5 to h6. King f5 to g6. Pawn h6 to h7. King g6 takes h7. Pawn f2 to f3. Pawn e4 takes f3, check. King g2 takes f3. King h7 to g6. King f3 to f4. King g6 to f7. King f4 to a5. King f7 to g6. King e5 to f4. King g6 to f7. King f4 to a5. King f7 to g6. Bishop c5 to a3. Pawn a4 to a3. Bishop e3 to c1. King g6 to f7. Pawn c4 to c5. King f7 to a7. Pawn c5 to c6. King e7 to d8. Pawn c6 to c7, check. King d8 to d7. Pawn c7 to c8, promoting to queen, check. King d7 takes c8. Pawn g5 to g6. King c8 to d7. Pawn g6 to g7. King d7 to a7. Bishop c1 takes a3, check. King e7 to f7. Bishop a3 to f8. King f7 to e8. Pawn a2 to a4. King e8 to f7. Pawn a4 to a5. King f7 to e8. Pawn a5 to a6. King e8 to f7. Pawn a6 to a7. King f7 to g8. King e5 to d4. King g8 to f7. King d4 to a4. King f7 to g8. King e4 to d5. King g8 to f7. King d5 to d4. King f7 to g8. King d4 to a4. King g8 to f7. King e4 to d4. King f7 to g8. King d4 to a5. King g8 to f7. King e5 to e4. King f7 to g8. King e4 to d4. King g8 to f7. King d4 to d5. King f7 to g8. King d5 to a4. King g8 to f7. King e4 to d5. King f7 to g8. King d5 to c4. King g8 to f7. King c4 to c3. King f7 to g8. King c3 to d3. King g8 to f7. King d3 to c3. King f7 to g8. King c3 to b2. King g8 to f7. King b2 to c2. King f7 to g8. King c2 to c3. King g8 to f7. King c3 to d3. King f7 to g8. King d3 to c2. King g8 to f7. King c2 to d3. King f7 to g8. King d3 to d2. King g8 to f7. King d2 to e3. King f7 to g8. King e3 to d3. King g8 to f7. King d3 to e3. King f7 to g8. King e3 to f3. King g8 to f7. King f3 to f4. King f7 to g8. King f4 to e3. King g8 to f7. King e3 to f4. King f7 to e6. Bishop f8 to c5. King e6 to f7. Bishop c5 to d4. King f7 to g8. Pawn a7 to a8, promoting to queen, check. King g8 to f7. Queen a8 to a2, check. King f7 to e7. Queen a2 to d5. King e7 to e8. Queen d5 to b7. King e8 to d8. Pawn g7 to g8, promoting to queen, checkmate.